You know by now that we're all about the journey. June's journey, that is. I feel this game was made for us specifically. It's the closest I've come to feeling like I've been dropped in the middle of a mystery novel set in the 1920s.
That's because you get to play as June, a globe-trotting flapper/amateur sleuth who lives to solve mysteries. You get to visit all sorts of fascinating places, from Paris to Cuba. You beat levels by identifying hidden objects in the scene. And we found that the more we play, the sharper our observational skills become.
The game is delightful, and a wonderful way to relax. I'll often pull my phone out and play it when I've got a free moment, like I'm on hold with an archive, or I'm waiting for a courthouse to open up in the morning. I'm currently on Chapter 16, meaning I'm searching for the son of June's housekeeper, who's on the run from New Orleans gamblers and the police. It's a wild time.
We know our audience is filled with folks who love a good mystery. Now is your chance to try your hand at being a sleuth yourself. Discover your inner detective when you download June's Journey for free today on iOS and Android. At The Murder Sheet, we love books and articles that challenge our thinking on true crime.
True crime, of course, is a sprawling genre that can incorporate everything from tabloid-style salaciousness to thought-provoking investigative journalism to chat-style shows with a flair for casual morbidity.
It's our belief that there's a lot of room for good and necessary work in this space, for raising awareness of broader social issues, for sensitive storytelling that can humanize the real people at the center of a mystery, and even for asking hard questions about what's going on with a case.
But there's a dark side too. We see plenty of troubling trends, especially around online misinformation and harassment, certain cases attracting outsized media attention, and problematic or incomplete narratives taking over. There are also deeper questions at the heart of true crime. Questions about coverage that can center perpetrators over victims. Questions about the re-traumatization of survivors and victims' families. Questions over the fear-mongering that the genre can entail.
Sarah Weinman is an award-winning writer and editor who has tackled all those issues and more in her career. She covers both true crime and crime fiction with an eye for big-picture questions. She's published 2 great books on true crime cases, Scoundrel, the true story of the murderer who charmed his way to fame and freedom, and The Real Lolita, a lost girl, an unthinkable crime, and a scandalous masterpiece.
She writes on crime and mystery for the New York Times Book Review. She's also compiled 2 anthologies on crime writing, Unspeakable Acts, True Tales of Crime, Murder, Deceit, and Obsession, and, most recently, Evidence of Things Seen, True Crime in an Era of Reckoning.
Evidence of Things Seen is just now hitting bookshelves. When we realized that, we knew we wanted to read it and talk to Sarah about it. This is a collection that gets into serious questions about the true crime genre and crime in general, grappling with violence against women, incarceration, racism, missing and murdered Indigenous women, the dilemmas of crime reporting, and the rise of online sleuths.
In this interview, we'll tackle some of the issues that a variety of writers cover in the book. We'll also talk about Sarah's past works as an editor and author, and we also ended up getting into a discussion about a mystery writer that we all love. My name is Anya Kane. I'm a journalist.
And I'm Kevin Greenlee. I'm an attorney.
We first connected while looking into the Burger Chef murders, an Indiana cold case. Together, we built a spreadsheet documenting hundreds of cases of restaurant-related homicides. That original spreadsheet gave way to our podcast, The Murder Sheet.
Now we maintain that same research-centric, investigative approach as we look into all sorts of homicides, including unsolved cases, historical crimes, and, of course, restaurant murders.
We don't just chat about the headlines. Our podcast is a platform for our journalism. The Murder Sheet focuses on investigative reporting, thoughtful analysis, thorough research, and in-depth interviews.
We're The Murder Sheet, and this is
True Crime Reckonings and Revelations, a conversation with Sarah Weinman on Evidence of Things Seen.
just wanted to say thank you so much, Sarah, for coming on our program. We're really excited to speak with you about this new collection, Evidence of Things Seen. And yeah, it's an honor to have you.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm so looking forward to our conversation.
Absolutely.
I'd like to start with actually the very beginning, which is the title. It's inspired by the title of a work by James Baldwin about the Atlanta child murders. So can you talk a little bit about Baldwin's work and how it may have inspired this anthology?
I mean, it absolutely inspired this anthology, and I discuss it in my editor's note to the collection. So Baldwin, and I should also note that he took that title from a biblical quote in the New Testament in Hebrews. And being Jewish, I'm not as well-versed in the New Testament as the Old Testament, but that's a side point. But he had been commissioned by Playboy. They had a single Black editor in the late 70s named Walter Lowe, and he wanted Baldwin to go to Atlanta to figure out what was going on with these child murders that were just proliferating to the astonishment and bafflement and outrage of the community, of the country, but especially just of Black people everywhere, being like, we're being ignored, our voices are not being heard. And so Baldwin, who was just one of the greatest writers America has ever seen, seemed like the perfect chronicler to go down there and figure out what was going on. But because he was James Baldwin, he wasn't going to come up with a traditional true crime narrative. So he was very critical and skeptical of what the police and the state government was doing, the city government was doing. He also, there's a really poignant scene where he is in the vicinity of one of the parents of the murdered children, and he just feels like he can't go up to her to speak with her because it would have said, he didn't use this language, but essentially he felt he would re-traumatize her and that his presence would not be welcome, that he wouldn't really be adding much to the conversation just by increasing their pain. So the resulting essay, which later was published in book form as Evidence of Things Not Seen in 1985, it's very elliptical. It's beautifully written. It's not so much of a heavy lift, but I think at the time it was published, people didn't really know what to do with it. They just couldn't classify it. They also didn't know what to do with it in the context of Baldwin's own career. And he was already getting a knock late in his life as, being passé, that there were other Black writers who had surpassed him, and he would be dead within 2 years. So this work was not exactly forgotten, but it just wasn't properly contextualized. But now there have been several revisitations of the book. I think the most notable other one was by Casey Sepp in The New Yorker. But I think now it is viewed as a really canonical crime nonfiction effort in this genre.
Absolutely. And I'm curious then, for Evidence of Things Seen, how do you come up with that idea and then kind of start running with it? I would love to know more about the inspiration and then the process of sort of getting that together.
So let me start first with the title, because obviously what's missing in the title is the word not. And the point I was trying to make is that it isn't so much what is unseen, it is what is seen, but we either willfully ignore, deliberately overlooked, and neglect. I mean, when it comes to systemic inequities like racism, socioeconomic issues, the unhoused, mental health, white nationalism, these are all problems that have persisted throughout America's existence. I mean, I like to say it, sort of as a joke, but because it's true, that America's greatest pastimes are white supremacy and grifting. And I think we just can't get past those particular pillars, however, negative they are, and they are, but they underpin so much of what is going on in American society. And since I think that crime stories and crime journalism are a window into how we behave as humans individually, but also collectively, it's really important to say, here's what we actually see, but we're just almost like in denial about what we actually see. So that's sort of the title/philosophy that underpins this anthology. From a more like logistical standpoint, a few years ago, I edited and published another true crime anthology called Unspeakable Acts. And I wanted to collect pieces that, to my mind, reflected the best crime writing in a nonfiction format. So true crime writing, depending on, how you decide to define it. The best pieces that came out after the first season of Serial in the fall of 2014, which I and others have dated as sort of the beginning of this ongoing true crime moment we have been in, which frankly has persisted a lot longer than I ever thought. And certainly by the time I was putting Unspeakable Acts together in 2019 and early 2020, I thought, oh, we're going to move past this. Like, people are going to get sick of true crime. But apparently that's not true. True crime really is a perennial favorite. And as I had said in the introduction to that anthology, we've been in this ongoing moment for many centuries. You could date it back to the Salem witch trials. You could date it back to, I don't know, Cain murdering Abel in the Bible. It depends on your definition. But the point being is, I think that as humans, we are always going to be fascinated by crimes, especially the outsized, the lurid. But it's really important to also take a look at the more everyday ones, the ones where there isn't like this great hook or the sense of saleability, that it is just the almost depressingly mundane of living in this society. So the third section of Unspeakable Acts dealt more with systemic issues. And I essentially wanted to do another anthology that was all that, if at all possible. But of course, in the intervening years, we also had a pandemic. We had protests in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. We have had the repeal of Roe v. Wade. We have had backlashes in every way, shape, or form to any signs of progress. We've had disruptions of social media. We have tremendous disinformation. We have conspiracy theories. So even though all of those things can't really be reflected in one anthology, I did want to collect pieces that gave that fuller picture from a more holistic, systemic standpoint.
We are so delighted to work with our sponsor, Brilliant Earth. This is a company that offers some of the most brilliant and romantic engagement rings and wedding bands out there, all the while ensuring a commitment to ethical sourcing and sustainability.
If you're looking to get married or to become engaged, or even if you're just searching for a special piece of fine jewelry, you have to check out their website. They make browsing so easy.
They even let you design your own perfect engagement ring. Or you can shop by style. I love the delicate willow rings, along with the 3-stone Nadia rings and the classic freesia rings. It's so hard to choose.
And you don't have to worry about the ethical implications of your purchase. Your special gift, your engagement ring, your wedding band should never be tarnished by the idea that the gems or materials came from an abusive system.
See, Brilliant Earth has a commitment to beyond conflict-free diamonds. That means one thing. They only accept diamonds from mining operations in countries that strictly follow international labor, trade, and environmental standards. Fewer than 1% of other diamond suppliers meet Brilliant Earth standards.
You can feel good about your purchase, knowing that you're supporting a brand that actually cares about its ethical impact and is committed to fostering better standards in the jewelry business.
Check out all of their beautiful pieces at brilliantearth.com. That's brilliantearth.com. HelloFresh is America's #1 meal kit for a reason. HelloFresh really wants you to have it all. Free time and fresh, tasty food. That's why they take care of all the meal planning and deliver the ingredients so everything you need to whip up a delicious meal arrives right to your door. We love the convenience of getting high-quality, pre-measured ingredients shipped right to our door so we can have the fun of cooking meals together in the kitchen without the pressure of worrying about whether or not we have all the items we need.
And let me stress that when we say high-quality ingredients, we really mean it. The last time I was in the grocery store, some of the produce I saw looked like it had been sitting out for weeks. And that is frustrating because this is the peak time for summer produce. Well, HelloFresh makes sure that their ingredients travel from the farm to your front door in less than 7 days. And when something is that fresh, it simply tastes better.
This is another great reason to try out HelloFresh. And remember, Murder Sheet listeners get a special discount.
Go to HelloFresh.com/MSheet50 and use code MSheet50 for 50% off plus free shipping. Again, go to hellofresh.com/MSheet50 and use code MSheet50 for 50% off plus free shipping. Find out why HelloFresh is America's #1 meal kit.
One quote that I loved in your editor's note at the beginning was, "It's not the evidence of what is unseen, but rather what society still refuses to see. When Lady Justice is willfully blind, how damaging are the costs and how irreparable is the harm?" And you sort of just got into that. I'm curious, with that, you mentioned the racism, mass incarceration, war on drugs, violence against women, homophobia, like just all of these, racism being such a part of the justice system, unfortunately. I think, one thing we try to do on our show is sort of like educate our listeners, or try to like talk about like what should we be looking out for in terms of systemic issues that might be, impacting a crime or our understanding of it. What do we do about this? Like, sometimes it's really hard to not just feel completely helpless. And that's such a dumb question, because like, we're just people talking, but like, I'm, as somebody who's edited this, has really grappled with all these works and all these issues. Are there things that you're thinking about as far as like getting organized, at least becoming more aware as a true crime audience, or maybe doing things to help?
I mean, yeah, it's a big question. Maybe it is the big question. And I think that getting overwhelmed by the enormity of what we are facing, we haven't even talked about climate change in any way either. There's just so much big stuff that it's really easy to kind of burrow like an ostrich and pretend that it's all not happening. But I do think that starting small, that even just doing a little bit that feels manageable, that as a collective, it can accomplish a lot. I mean, there's a reason why in activist circles, only a few people in a given group do the really outside stuff. I think ACT UP, they had this inside-outside phenomenon where you had people who were sort of working governments and companies and, just doing it with their skill sets, sort of soft skills. And then you had the people on the streets shouting and doing direct action. And you need all of it, is my point. And unfortunately, especially with activism, is that people get together, they try to reinvent wheels, they end up fighting, they end up splintering, they end up, falling for the siren lure of money. And these are all cycles that tend to repeat themselves. And I think in true crime, and especially the true crime genre, it's not immune from any of this, not just in terms of how they examine issues, but also, I think there's this amazing essay that came out maybe a year or so ago by Enzo Jaksic. I don't know if you saw it. It was on Medium. He talks about the true crime personality. And unfortunately, there are people who arrive in true crime spaces, especially those that are populated by family members of victims, other people related to it, or because it's a genre that is so built up about fear, be it what we fear or other people's fears, that there's some people can come along and sort of exploit that or turn it into entertainment and don't realize that there's a real human cost to it. So these are all the things that, are sort of marinating as I think about my own relationship to true crime. And it's another way of trying to answer your original question about how, what do we do with it all? And as a journalist, all I can say is I'm never going to accomplish everything I set out to do, but all I can do is try and just try a little harder and a little better each time out.
It also gets back to the whole issue of grifters as an American.
Yes.
We just talked with a journalist who did a kind of an expose on the VDOC Society, right?
That was an incredible piece. Oh my God. I remember when I got the print edition first, and I read that piece and my jaw dropped, because I once did a piece on The Boy in the Box. It was actually my first ever true crime feature. I was in my late 20s. I did not know what I was doing. It was for the Philadelphia City paper back when there were alt weeklies. And I pitched my editor, who was also a crime writer, Dwayne Trzynski, and said, this is the 50th anniversary of The Boy in the Box. I should write something. And he greenlit it pretty fast. And I just remember like shadowing certain retired detectives, but also running into the orbit of the VDOC Society and thinking, oh, this is interesting, but I didn't really know what to make of it. And then Herbert comes out with this piece. And, most of what he was doing was contextualizing what was already known. I mean, he did a lot of great reporting, and he gets these insane and amazing quotes from Walter. Like, holy crap. But it was, I was so impressed with his shoe leather reporting and just, putting it all in one big meaty feature. And there's a similar case that happened in France with this guy, Stéphane Bourgogne, who, characterized himself as the serial killer whisperer, that he had interviewed lots of them, and that he was a profiler, and he made stuff up about his life. And I just think that there is this line between perpetrator and fraudster, and it can be very easy, especially if you have a personality that lends itself to self-aggrandizement. And, like maybe I don't want to speculate on anybody's personalities, but it does seem to correlate with if you have this incredible emptiness inside that you're trying to fill it up with, outside external forces. And then it just builds and builds and builds into this snowball. And suddenly you're in the middle of it and you're considered to be an expert. And it's like, how do you break free of this? I don't know. But these characters definitely fascinate me too.
Yeah. It brings to mind, the old saying is, it's not what you don't know that's the problem, is what you think you know that's not so, which there's a certain aspect of that with the VDOC Society. And of course, that came to mind when I was reading the essay in this book about Baltimore police.
Yes, Lara Bazelon's piece.
It's a great piece. And of course, years ago, I read David Simon's Homicide. I watched the TV show Homicide, and it's full of these colorful characters who are solving crimes in, dramatic and interesting ways. But of course, it turns out that's not the whole story. Can you talk about that?
I mean, I think both Lara Bazelon's piece on the Baltimore police and the underlying basis for Homicide and The Wire, it's twinned in my mind with Diana Moskowitz's piece on Edna Buchanan. And I think I chose both of them because both David Simon and Edna Buchanan were pretty formative writers, and in Simon's case, a showrunner in the collective consciousness, but also like I read Homicide, I read The Coroner, and with Edna Buchanan, I really read The Corpse Had a Familiar Face, and especially her Britt Montero crime novels. But there's also this still pretty good New Yorker piece that Calvin Trillin did, I think right when The Corpse Had a Familiar Face came out in the mid 80s, and she had, I think, just won the Pulitzer. And the point I'm trying to make is that, in the 80s, there wasn't this interrogation of whether the police could be at fault. So if a police shot an unarmed Black man, there could be, and there often was, backlash and criticism. But the likelihood is that, they wouldn't get indicted by the grand jury, or if they were, that they would skate because people just didn't know what to do. They couldn't conceive that there was an issue that police shouldn't be out on the streets killing unarmed Black people. So I think I wanted to include that partly because they reflect my own reading experiences and my own sense of having to interrogate anew some of these ideas and tropes that we just kind of took as gospel for so long, and hope that, in our more recent true crime moment does feature much more of this interrogation. And it does feature much more of, maybe we shouldn't take initial police reports about anything as the official source. That if a murder happens or if a police shooting happens, you get a press release and then you go and look for second and third sources. It also, I think, underscores how so much of reporting, but also crime reporting, because it's a beat, you hang out at the police station, you hang out at the courthouse. These are the people you befriend. These are the people who are feeding you information. But there was a lot less of, well, what about hanging out in the communities where these crimes are taking place in disproportionate numbers? What are you going to uncover? who's going to trust you? And so that's why I really believe that the best crime reporting, and really the best reporting, period, comes from people who are members of the communities where they are reporting on. Because, for example, like I'm talking to you, I'm a white lady, and there are just certain types of stories that I wouldn't feel comfortable telling, that I feel like I would be imposing my sense of perspective, this sort of, parachuting in and trying to convey what's really going on here. And it's like, no, that's why it was so important to search out stories that do reflect this kind of community-based reporting, like Brandy Morin's piece on Indigenous women and girls who go missing in California. And she does incredible work in Canada and the United States. So does Connie Walker, who hosts these wonderful podcasts. First it was Missing and Murdered, and now it's Stolen. So that's, in the Indigenous communities, but also just looking afield at Black reporters and podcasters who are doing tremendous work, those in the Latinx community, those in just any marginalized community. They're just going to have a sense of perspective that hardened journalists just can't have anymore, if they ever had.
Absolutely. And like just the human impact of the crimes, that can get lost when there's beat capture with, like a police station. I loved the sort of, as you mentioned, like interrogation of sort of the traditional mode of crime reporting. Sophie Hagney's piece To the Son of the Victim also really kind of looks into like the real world impact of just simply asking questions on a person's first day where they've just lost somebody. And that's not something that anybody who has not worked as a crime reporter necessarily has had to grapple with. And, just kind of like not taking that for granted that could be re-traumatizing. And we talked a bit about even Baldwin's perspective on that at the beginning, that like, it's not a job without, it's really kind of, even just basic ethical concerns. And I know Diana Moskovitz even kind of writes at one point, like basically, I wonder why nobody asked why my job was necessary, why everyone believes we live in a world filled with crime. We do not. And that it must include crime reporters. And I mean, I think we're probably biased, Kevin and I, but we believe crime journalism is necessary. But we also believe that some of these concerns and issues about how it affects families, how it affects a community are really relevant and pressing. And so I guess, how do you think about that, about the necessity of crime journalism, but maybe reframing it in a different, more empathetic way?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've always tried to set out in my work, be it the nonfiction books that I've written and published, the feature reporting that I've done, and the anthologies that I've edited, to try to flip the usual script on how we think about true crime and crime reporting. And it is heartening to see much more of a shift towards centering those who are victims of crime and family members of victims of crime and those communities that are kind of left behind. There's a piece that I still can't stop thinking about, which came out in The Atlantic, I think in May or maybe even early last month, by McKay Coppins, where he goes down to Moscow, Idaho, and it is essentially been completely overrun by crime journalists, by amateur sleuths, by TikTok so-called detectives, by television types, all of them asking the same things over and over and over again, to the point where Coppins, who's reporting on this for a prestigious magazine, who's a Mormon, who's coming in and just, has at least some sense of what the community actually is like, and they still don't want to talk to him. And frankly, why should they? And I often say to a lot of my journalist friends that I've arrived at a sense of what I tell sources. I'm a journalist. That means you should never talk to journalists, because we're out there and our agenda is not your agenda. And it's important that they align, but they're not actually necessarily in tune with one another. So I think thinking through that and thinking about my own sense of responsibility, and especially my own moral culpability as I do a lot of this reporting, it's made me change up how I approach sources. I still have to cold call people. I hate it. I don't, I mean, there's no getting around that, but sometimes there's no other choice. I'm not good at doorstepping when I haven't at least tried to make contact in some other way. But what I often try to do now, whenever possible, is reach out to a source and just, do so from a sense of, here's why I'm reaching out. I'm happy to tell you more. We don't have to be on the record yet. And it's really just a sense of letting them feel comfortable and ready if they ever are. I think a lot too about a book that came out in March that I blurbed called We Were Once a Family by Roxana Asgharian. She was for a while a reporter at Texas Tribune, and she's freelance for a lot of other places. And she specializes in reporting about child welfare. So her book, which started with the unspeakable tragedy that happened in Oregon, where this lesbian couple drove their Black adopted kids off a cliff, and it was awful. So she reported on it, not in the way that a lot of media, and especially true crime type media, reported on it, which was focusing on the couple. She wanted to focus on the birth parents of these kids and how they were removed from their care in Texas in particular. So she really had to work so hard to earn their trust. And she is very open about how she gains their trust, that in one case, it took a year before one of the biological siblings felt ready and comfortable to actually go on the record with her. But she was still putting in the time and the work to just hang out and be there. And sometimes he'd say, I'm ready. And then he would get cold feet and change his mind. And these are the kinds of things that you have to do. And it can be incredibly frustrating. But being a good journalist means surrendering to other people's timetables, that you cannot really rush them into, just because you have a deadline, that doesn't mean that anybody's going to meet that. And nor should they, because in the end, we're the ones who are making demands on their psyches to convey information that they might be sick of conveying. And, everybody's frankly in a precarious state of mental health, especially after the last few years. So just being mindful of that is incredibly important to me.
Absolutely. I'll tell you, one thing that kind of gets me nowadays is just the impact of the internet and the social media sleuthing. And obviously there can be good sides to that, but also a level of obsessiveness and scrutiny that people who may just have a small connection to a case come under. We, with our sources, with Delphi in particular, I think I drive people crazy because I try to do, I think I stole this from someone on Twitter, but a reporter's Miranda rights of just being you may feel comfortable talking with us about this, but just know that if you use your name, people are going to be putting you on Reddit. And, you just really, it's just such a weird landscape at this moment.
Yeah. I've had to talk through with sources about maybe you should lock down your social media before the piece goes up, or make sure that your name isn't out there on these databases that as a journalist I pay for access to, because you don't want people in bad faith disseminating your personal information, which they will do.
We've been talking mostly now about the supply side of true crime, but in your introduction, or your editor's note rather, you talk also a little bit about the demand side. At one point you write, while collective interest in true crime has only grown since the first season of Serial in 2014, so too has it morphed into something larger and more troubling, reflecting the acceleration of what we cannot look away from. Can you share some of the things you find troubling about the interest in true crime these days?
Well, I did mention the whole thing that was happening in Moscow, Idaho. And I think that's one example. Or the attention, positive, but mostly, I think, deleterious, related to the Gabrielle Petito case, which became this TikTok sensation. And people went and just, made all sorts of wild claims when it really was just another example of the awful mundanity of how we live, which is this poor young woman who's in this emotionally and physically abusive relationship and goes on a road trip and meets her end. And it's just that's so damn sad. And somehow it became this gigantic spectacle. And that, of course, made it sadder. I wrote the introduction before I wrote my op-ed for the New York Times, but I think they share a lot of the same DNA, which is that as a journalist, I'm really focused on getting at the truth as much as it is possible to get at the truth. So when I see true crime type properties, especially those that purport to be true, play fast and loose with the facts, it really kind of gets my goat. And that's what led to the incredibly strange experience of watching granted, it was a feature film. So this was the Boston Strangler movie with Keira Knightley playing the reporter Loretta McLaughlin, and I think Carrie Coon was in it. And there was one scene late in the film where the Loretta McLaughlin character is speaking with this convicted murderer named George Nassar. And it's like sort of presented as a semi-pivotal scene with relation to Albert DeSalvo, who is credited as being the strangler, but DNA is only tied him to one murder of Mary Sullivan at the very end. So then there's a title card at the end of the Strangler film, where there was, that said Nassar is still in prison. And I thought, well, that's weird, because I remember watching this local TV spot from 2018, and he said that he was dying of prostate cancer, or some cancer. I can't quite recall now. So I picked up the phone. I just started calling and said, is he still in prison? And finally, I got somebody at the corrections department in Massachusetts to at least verify that, no, he was no longer alive. And then I emailed somebody at the obits department of the New York Times, because this is the thing, when you write for a paper and you write for different sections, you end up being in contact with a lot of different departments. So I knew people at the obits section, and including the editor, Bill McDonald. I emailed him and said, okay, I think I've taken this as far as I can. I need more resources. So can you just find out what's going on here? And then a little while later, Rick Sandomir, who's an obit writer, got in touch with me and said, yeah, so we verified when he died. It was 6 weeks after that interview. And can you just tell us what happened? I said, well, it's funny you mentioned I'm working on this op-ed, so you can just quote this part. And so, but then the larger op-ed was really about, what does this mean? Like, when we end up putting faith in things that are not true and reality is distorted, that's part of this much larger problem of misinformation and conspiracy mongering. And if real life trauma and pain gets put through that mill, it's the results are never good. I mean, look at what happened with the Seth Rich story, where this poor young man is murdered in DC. They haven't caught him for any number of reasons, but also because, Metro DC police is probably overmatched and might not have as much to go on as they hoped for. And then it's just run through the InfoWars mill. And his parents are just traumatized over and over and over again. And they're trying to get recourse from Fox News to some avail, but not really. So to me, it's all tied into all of the stuff related to what is true and what is not. And so, yeah, we have to remember, if we're talking about true crime, it has to be true.
Yeah, I think that's so well said. And I'll tell you, I think there's such a link between conspiracy theories and true crime. Like, it's very hard to separate, because, as you so aptly said earlier, true crime is it plays upon fears, right? And so do conspiracy theories. So I feel like it's very easy for people, if they don't necessarily have like the media literacy or the kind of, understanding of what is a reliable source, what may not be, to just slide down. And it's always, I don't know why, but my insider editor, like years ago, allowed me to write about the Popish plot in England, which happened in the 1600s. But it was literally like a murder of a beloved, local official that got spun into this conspiracy theory where people were trying to kill the king, and like all these people got executed. And then it turned out the guy was just a 17th century Reddit lurker, essentially, who just was like made it up and like wrote a pamphlet. But it just, nothing ever changes, unfortunately. No. That's not entirely true, but like there's nothing under the sun.
Human behavior is pretty immutable. All that changes is the way that we deliver the information. That's another thing too, which is that wherever there's a major technological change, true crime is kind of like wagging its tail and accompanying it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Printing press, there was an explosion, and now with the internet, it's happening all over again, essentially. But, I wanted to kind of go back. We've been talking about some of these really big issues. We're just, fascinated with like how true crime gets together on some level. And, like just for you as an editor, I'm just curious, like, how are you going about like identifying, okay, these are the pieces that I think would really speak to these topics? Mm-hmm. And then securing permission. I know that's probably kind of in the weeds, but I would just...
Oh, no, I love being in the weeds. So I'm so glad you asked that. So after my last book, Scoundrel, came out in February of 2022, and the promotional window kind of wound down, it was around April. And I thought, okay, I had already signed the contract with my existing publisher, Echo, to do a follow-up anthology on Unspeakable Acts. And I finally had this window to kind of put it all together. So all the while, I had this Word document where anytime I would see a true crime essay or feature or reported piece, I'd list it with the link and the publication. And so I had this big master list. So the back matter of both Unspeakable Acts and Evidence of Things Seen includes essentially all of the pieces that I felt to be notable, which was essentially, transplanting that Word doc to the printed page. And from there, I was trying to figure out, well, okay, if I'm doing this particular anthology with an argument about true crime in with respect to systemic inequities and maybe getting at ways in which change could maybe kind of happen. And I say that with that question mark because, I'm a hopeful person, but I'm also really pragmatic, and I know how slow change can be. But even within that sense, I think that it's still possible. So first, I wanted pieces that got at some of the big issues. I knew I wanted a piece about mass shootings, and I loved Mei Zhang's Vanity Fair piece about the Atlanta spa case and how it tied into immigration and, just really looking at big picture stuff. I wanted pieces that were mostly published during and after the onset of the pandemic. The only one that was right before was Michael Hobbs's piece on white collar crime, because I felt like it was really important to, first of all, I enjoyed that piece when it came out, but I also thought it relayed something so important about how the criminal legal system doesn't work, especially with respect to rich, affluent types who just keep getting away with their crimes and, making a subtle argument that this is how politics and government actually works, and it's depressing as hell, but we need to know. I wanted a piece about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And I'm Canadian, so I always try to have a little bit of CanCon. So I thought, and when I found Brandy's piece in National Geographic, I thought this is amazing. And I think, and I've read her memoir, which came out last year, which is also wonderful. And then the second section, it was more about interrogating true crime creators and how people are sort of run through the true crime mill, which is why I reprinted Amanda Knox's essay that grew out of a tweet thread and then was collected and edited into that essay. Because Amanda Knox, the public figure, is very different from Amanda, the actual inner self, and that obviously got completely lost when she was arrested and wrongfully convicted and then freed, and now she's back in the States. And of course, now that she and her husband run a production company and they do a podcast, they're sort of part of this industry too. But that's why it was really fascinating that they did a miniseries where they kind of also addressed the ethics of true crime and got at it from all sorts of different angles. So I'm very interested to see what Amanda's career is going to, how it's going to go from here. And then with the last section, I called it Shards of Justice because, again, I don't think we will ever really get full justice. I don't think that the criminal legal system is often the right avenue for it. And it's really hard to convey that to someone who is in this terrible emotional state after a loved one is harmed or murdered. You can't just be all dispassionate and be like, well, you can't expect that. I mean, that's a terrible thing, which is also why Amelia Schonbeck's piece on restorative justice was so powerful, because you really get that full spectrum of, is forgiveness possible? Can someone really overcome this terrible crime? And what do we, it's sort of the what do we do with the sexual assaulters who don't quite rise to the level of full criminal, or even if they did, but they still have to be integrated back into society. So if we believe in rehabilitation and we believe that too many people are incarcerated, well, how can we actually sit with these feelings?
It's messy, but that kind of how that could be healing for a victim as well as a perpetrator.
And I think that's ultimately the main point of Evidence of Things Seen as an anthology, which is that life is messy and we're constantly craving narratives and we desperately want answers. But I think true crime as a genre has to move past getting answers and on to asking more questions.
That reminds me, speaking of unspeakable acts, one essay from that lives like rent free in my head and has for years is Alice Boleyn's on the ethical, I believe the ethical dilemma of highbrow true crime.
Yes. Her collection Dead Girls is just so great. And, she and Rachel Monroe, who wrote Savage Appetites, that came out the following year, that's again interrogates a lot of the true crime archetypes. They're so important in how I think about this genre. And that essay in particular, I read it and I was like, this makes me feel uncomfortable. I need to reprint it.
It was uncomfortable, but like so needed, because it's like, it gets at, I'm certainly not accusing any show or anything like that, but just speaking generally, like when there's an effort to make true crime highbrow and sort of palatable for, more, like somebody who wants to feel good about their consumption habits, it does kind of get into some sort of hypocrisy, because it's basically dressing up something that could be very salacious or upsetting or traumatizing, but, saying, oh, don't worry about this. It's, there's no calories in it, basically. And I just, the ethics washing of true crime, I think, if you're just saying over and over, this is what's ethical, but there's not really any, interrogation of issues beyond that. It's just branding,
Yeah.
And, oh man, I love that piece. But it was definitely uncomfortable making, as were a lot of pieces in this. And that's why I love this collection so much, because it really kind of gets people thinking, especially people who, care about true crime or in the space. I feel like these are questions that absolutely need to be grappled with. We talked a bit about the Petito case,
yes.
Recently, and I thought Mei Jiang's piece and some of these other pieces also did, a great job raising issues around, race and how that pertains to true crime, and how, even though I think that, for lack of a better term, like democratization of true crime, and like, anybody can start a podcast, essentially, like a lot of it opens doors to people, and that means more voices can be heard. But we still are grappling with missing white woman syndrome. Like, that has not gone away. And
I don't think it will ever fully go away. And then the reason is because it's very easy to latch on to cases that have, some kind of, commercial saleability factor, and the disappearance or murder of a young, beautiful, white, cis, heterosexual, usually girl or young woman, somebody who, can be sexualized in the coverage and turned into tabloid fare. I think it's all part of this impulse we have for rubbernecking and figuring it out. And, there is this sense of who do we identify with, and too many people can't identify across racial lines or gender lines or sexuality lines. And, from my standpoint, that's their problem. It's like, I can identify. I as a journalist and as a writer, I it's kind of my job to empathize as much as possible with everybody, and that includes perpetrators, unfortunately. But de-emphasizing them is still really important. So I don't see them going away, but I do feel like whenever it's possible to amplify other voices or recontextualize or just add more to the mix, then I think we can at least make an attempt to do better. I mean, it's kind of like, and I've said this before, that it might be a little unfair to compare, say, a rigorous piece of investigative reporting in any medium, but especially, say, a podcast, to a chat cast where people are just like talking about true crime and not really caring if they get the facts right. On the one hand, they are different genres, but on the other hand, it's like, why can't the chat cast try to up their standards and do some research and just not rush into things, that they can actually take the time before going on the air, just going, do we get our facts right? Have we done the requisite research? If we're telling stories, are we telling the right stories? If we're building on somebody's reporting, are we crediting them appropriately and not just stealing them? So this is why I keep coming back to, it's better to ask questions. And even if it feels like you're just reflexively asking so many questions that your brain hurts, but if your brain hurts, you're kind of doing something right.
I wanted to talk about some of your earlier books, because you've also written your own book-length true crime stories.
Yes.
And I'm curious, what is it about a true crime case that makes you realize, oh, there's enough here for a book?
So I published 2 books. The first was The Real Lolita, which was on the real life case that inspired the novel. And that grew out of a magazine piece I wrote for the Canadian publication Hazlitt. So I did a lot of reporting on the actual kidnapping and trajectory of this 11-year-old girl named Sally Horner, who is mentioned in Lolita late in the novel when the anti-hero, or whatever you want to call him, Humbert, he is sort of reflecting on his life. And at one point he thinks, had I done to Dolores Hayes, the girl who he calls Lolita, had I done to her what Frank LaSalle, a 50-year-old mechanic, had done to 11-year-old Sally Horner in 1948. And there was a piece in the Times Literary Supplement that connected the dots between this actual girl and kidnapping. But it was done by a literary scholar, so he wasn't going to go out and find people who knew Sally. Like, that just wasn't his job. But it made me think, who had done this? And if not, maybe I should. So I investigated what happened to Sally as much as possible. I tracked down her niece, and at the time, her brother-in-law, when he was still alive. Her sister had died before I reached her. I also tracked down the perpetrator's daughter, who went on the record with me then, but then for the book, after the piece published, she stopped talking to me. And again, I can kind of understand why. This is very painful, and she just didn't know the whole story while her father was still alive. So after the piece published, and it did remarkably well, it was in like November of 2014. And I knew even while I was reporting it out that there were more questions that I had. I wanted to get a little bit deeper into Nabokov's writing life, why he was so obsessed with telling a story about a middle-aged man's obsession and lust for a 12-year-old girl, and why this theme kept kind of recurring in his work. But I also wanted to ask deeper questions about the relationship between real-life trauma and pain and art. So it's like, if you're transforming life into art, what responsibilities do you have as a novelist or as a creator to that original life, which is itself transformed into a story? So, and even just writing that book, I was very conscious of narrative and what I was doing to shape the narrative. So that came out in 2018. And Scoundrel actually was supposed to be the next magazine piece that I wrote for Hazlitt. And I started on that at the December 2014, early 2015. And I realized pretty quickly that certain key sources were not going to talk to me so long as the titular scoundrel in question, Edgar Smith, who had been on death row for the murder of a 15-year-old girl named Victoria Zelinsky in Bergen County, New Jersey. But he was eventually freed from death row through the efforts of people like William F. Buckley, who was the founder of National Review and a major conservative figure and cultural commentator from the 1950s onward. So because he believed that Edgar was innocent, it just snowballed into essentially inevitable tragedy. But there were just certain women who were in his life or related to his life that weren't going to speak with me because he was known to be litigious. And even just the correspondence that I had with him at the time, brief as it was, just kind of confirmed that. So I thought, it feels like a book and I'm going to wait. And then I was finishing up the first draft of The Real Lolita, and I learned a couple of months after the fact that he had died in prison. So Smith, after being freed for Victoria Zelinsky's murder, after spending almost 15 years on death row, he has a few years of freedom, and then all the old rage comes back. He's out in San Diego. He doesn't have a job, and he goes to a parking lot. A woman walks by. He grabs her, takes her into his car, and tries to kill her, and comes really close. But he's caught because he just makes so many mistakes, and eventually he is arrested in Vegas and spends the rest of his life in prison. And it's like, what did we learn from this? But whatever. But after he died, people did start speaking with me. And it became a much richer story, especially when I learned of a whole trove of letters between him and his book editor that kind of went off the rails. So that book asked deeper questions about whom we choose to believe and why somebody like Edgar Smith gets the benefit of the doubt of public intellectuals and other smart types when so many other people who are either on death row or in prison who are not youngish white male don't get that same attention or consideration.
Yeah, that was a terrific book. Years and years ago, I picked up a copy of Brief Against Death, which of course was...
Oh, wow. Okay, yes.
Memoir. I remember reading this, it must have been like 15, 20 years ago, and thinking, this doesn't ring true at all, and always wondering what the rest of the story was. So I felt like Scoundrel was written for me. So it was a terrific book.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It's funny because when I read Brief Against Death, I felt like I was caught up in a man's manipulation, but it was better written than it had a right to be. And there was this sort of propulsive power to it. And now we know it's because his editor, Sophie Wilkins, had such a heavy hand on it and really just put him through his paces while she was also kind of falling for him and getting caught up in this very weird sort of epistolary sexual relationship, because obviously he's on death row. Nothing is going to actually happen. And the few times they did meet in person, he was very, very different than his letters, to the point where it actually confused and annoyed Sophie, and that she'd just be like, well, clearly we'll just go back to the letters. So there was a lot of denial happening. But then reading Edgar's subsequent books, especially his novel A Reasonable Doubt, which he also wrote on death row, in some ways that was worse, because fictionalizing Vicky and making her this incredibly sexualized creature, and he just he really pays far too much attention to her body and how lascivious she is and what a slut she is. And it's just like, this is gross. But it's especially gross knowing that he killed her. But at the time it was published, there was enough doubt that people in Mawa and Ramsey and the other related Bergen County towns would be like, why is he getting so much attention? He's a murderer. Why didn't the state kill him years ago? But at the same time, there was enough that was wrong with the original interrogation that releasing him for that reason actually made sense. So he should have. So that's why I say the book is a tragedy, because everything that happened probably should have happened. But unfortunately, Victoria Zelinsky's life was still lost, and Lisa Osbin's life was very nearly lost. And her life was permanently altered. The Zelinsky family's lives were very irrevocably altered. And that's what needs greater attention. And also the women that Edgar was married the two women he married, and others that he was romantically involved with, and the abuse and the fear that they felt. That was much more important to me than Edgar, who I think it became clear to me that he was the least interesting person in this narrative.
I wanted to, before we sort of wrap up, jump into Margaret Millar, because
yes,
that is an author who, you have sort of, written about and sort of, I think brought to the attention of a lot of people, including us. I mean, I think I said this before we started talking, but I really don't understand why she's not named amongst the great mystery writers of America. I think it's really a shame that her husband, who wrote under the pen name Ross MacDonald, but of course was really named Ken Millar, I don't know why he's remembered. He's great too. I really enjoy his books, but I mean, she's something special. And I was just wondering, you've done actually reporting on her and some of her troubled life,
Yes.
in addition to, you know, her actual literary merits. And I just wanted to get a chance to talk with you about her before we wrapped up.
I'm trying to think when I first read a Margaret Millar. I think the first book of hers I read was Beast in View, which was later part of the Women Crime Writers set that I edited for the Library of America. So before I went into editing anthologies of nonfiction, I edited anthologies of crime fiction. So first there was a trade paperback anthology called Troubled Daughters, Twisted Wives, which came out 10 years ago, which is phenomenal to me, unbelievable to me. And the tagline was Stories from the Trailblazers of Domestic Suspense, because I just felt like there was this untapped group of women crime writers who were not writing detective stories, and they were not writing hard-boiled and noir. They were doing something else that was more suspense-driven, that was easily adapted into films, and that was getting at real societal fears, especially about what it is to be a woman in a society that is determined to hate you and kill you forever. So I reprinted a story that's a little bit on the woo-woo side called The People Across the Canyon that Millar had written. And then Beast in View was part of the Women Crime Writers set. And now there's an upcoming new 1960s Library of America set that's including Millar's The Fiend, which came out in 1964. And I reread that, and I was reminded how much I love that book, but also, I mean, it's a hell of a trick to pull off a book where a pedophile is actually one of the most sympathetic characters in the book, and that everybody else in town is just so detestable, even the kids. And you're like, what is going on here? I think her work stands the test of time, and for the same reason why she keeps having to be rediscovered, which is there's the way that she writes about, especially suburbia and people and marriages. There's this underlying nasty current that somehow in a Patricia Highsmith novel, because it's about men and it's about like weird stuff happening and the, abrupt impulse of killing another man and just a lot of psychosexual stuff, and a lot of, especially with Ripley, how he gets away with murder again and again and again, that somehow like she's been canonized by male critics and writers. And with Ross Macdonald, there was actually a concerted effort to do this in the mid to late 60s. It involved the then editor of the New York Times Book Review, a critic at Time magazine, the writer Eudora Welty, who had her own epistolary emotional affair with Ken, which was very sweet, but also it's so sad because he got Alzheimer's and, just the dementia overcame everything. But also just the Millar marriage was very fascinating to me. I mean, the fact that he was Ken Miller and she was Margaret Millar, like just that little shift in how they had their last names was just so strange to me. And so I just got interested in what happened to Linda, their daughter, because she had killed a young boy and injured another in a car accident when she was in her teens. And the Millars did everything in their power to keep her out of prison. And then she goes missing when she's a student at UC Davis. And then she eventually dies at 31 of what was presented as like natural causes, but was almost certainly a deliberate drug overdose. And then her son also ODs so it's just like there was this incredible intergenerational current of tragedy among the Millar family. And I had to kind of figure out what was going on, but I had to I wrote this piece that Crime Reads published in late 2020 called Linda Interrupted, where I just try to unpack it all. So I went back and I read Tom Nolan's biography on Ross Macdonald, which is excellent. I found some court documents that were still around from the 50s about Linda's case, and just I tracked down the boy who'd been injured, and he spoke to me a little bit. He ended up, I think he was a retired professor of psychology, and he was well into his 70s when I found him, and he'd never spoken to a journalist before. And I found Linda's widower, who at the time was pushing 90 and was a very strange character to speak to. But also it was like early COVID and nobody, we were all in this, like, what is going on? And no one knows what anything kind of phase. And here I am reporting out the story. But mostly what came through is a girl who, she just didn't have a chance. Like, she had these parents who were brilliant and she was brilliant, but she never got the love and attention that she needed. Margaret didn't believe in like attachment theory. She was very distant towards her daughter, and Ken was maybe too protective and too close. So there were just a lot of weirdness happening, and it made me more fascinated with the Millars, and it certainly did not detract from me loving their work. But I think as married people, they were a mess, and that mess carried through across multiple generations.
Oh yeah, that comes through loud and clear in Linda Interrupted. And I mean, it's fascinating to read The Moving Target, the first Lou Archer novel that Ross MacDonald wrote, and of course that's his series character. Okay, there's a real kidnapping, we need to deal with this, it's a real crime. And then like so much of his later work is like, I'm not really sure if this is how it seems, and these young people are pretty messed up by their parents in actuality, so should we blame them? I mean, it's fascinating to see how their really troubled life and marriage kind of seeps into their actual fictional output.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite Margaret Millar book? I gotta ask.
I mean, Beast in View, which was the one that I reprinted, and The Fiend. But my other favorite is How Like an Angel, which had that PI. And it's just so great. It's been a while since I reread it, and I would like to go back and see what I think. But I think I would love it even more.
I gotta say, that's Beast in View and The Fiend are by far like the tour de force books that are probably the best. But I think How Like an Angel, I love that she's sort of almost subtly mimicking her husband's style.
Yeah.
Like
mimicking and maybe satirizing.
Yeah, she's like, I'm a PI, I'm coming to town. I think there's some bad stuff that happened here in the past. Let's see if that's relevant. I mean, it's beautiful. And I just love that her writing style is so good. And A Cult of Hippies in the Woods. I mean, yes.
Yeah, totally.
That's what you need. Well, Sarah, this has been so wonderful. We really enjoyed speaking with you. I guess before we wrap up, is there anything else that you wanted to talk about with the recent collection, anything in true crime that you're sort of thinking of? Or that you think our listeners should sort of be chewing on as far as that goes?
I mean, I feel like we covered the gamut pretty well. And I think just if whoever is consuming true crime at any stage just takes a beat to go, why am I doing this? What am I getting out of it? Is this actually furthering harm, or is it helping? And just being a little bit more of an active consumer without necessarily being an active participant is a good thing. But, that's why I just keep hammering home this idea of, if we keep asking questions, we make space for even more questions. And if we keep interrogating our own impulses, we might arrive at someplace better.
Awesome.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
Thank you. This was such a pleasure. It was so great to speak with both of you.
We want to thank Sarah for taking the time to share her thoughts and insights with us. We really appreciate her speaking with us.
We'll include links to evidence of things seen, along with her other books and works, in our show notes.
Also, if you like crime fiction, check out Margaret Millar. We'll also throw in some links to some of our favorite books by her.
Thanks so much for listening to The Murder Sheet. If you have a tip concerning one of the cases we cover, please email us at murdersheet@gmail.com. If you have actionable information about an unsolved crime, please report it to the appropriate authorities.
If you're interested in joining our Patreon, that's available at www.patreon.com/murdersheet. If you want to tip us a bit of money for records requests, you can do so at www.buymeacoffee.com/murdersheet. We very much appreciate any support.
Special thanks to Kevin Tyler Greenlee, who composed the music for The Murder Sheet, and who you can find on the web at kevintg.com.
If you're looking to talk with other listeners about a case we've covered, you can join the Murder Sheet discussion group on Facebook. We mostly focus our time on research and reporting, So we're not on social media much. We do try to check our email account, but we ask for patience as we often receive a lot of messages. Thanks again for listening. Hello, Murder Sheet listeners. Thank you so much for sticking with us until the very end. Just wanted to take a moment as we close out to thank our sponsor, HelloFresh, America's #1 meal kit. They are #1 for a reason, folks. Kevin and I have been loving the meals we're getting from HelloFresh. We're talking farm fresh produce, protein, all sorts of customizable options to get you exactly what you and your family need. It's very delicious, it's very nutritious, and it's quite affordable. So it ticks off all our boxes. We've been very happy with the service. And, would love for you guys to try it out if you're curious, or if you've tried it out in the past and enjoyed it, get that discount. It's hellofresh.com/msheet16. And then you're going to plug in the code msheet16. You get 16 free meals plus free shipping. You can't beat that. We've really been delighted by it. We work very hard on the podcast. It takes up a lot of time. It's our small business. We really enjoy the work. We enjoy conversing with all of you every week. But at the same time, it's nice for Kevin and I to kind of have something to do outside of office hours, and cooking these meals has been really fun. We're terrible in the kitchen, like disastrous. I mean, like I can tell you horror stories. I probably shouldn't get into it on the podcast, but I mean, some pretty disastrous moments involving our cooking. Nothing life-threatening, but definitely stuff that we tried to be overly ambitious about, and it either went horribly wrong or it ended up costing like way more than it should have because we didn't properly like think about ingredients, and we're not gifted in the realm of the kitchen. But HelloFresh makes us pretend like we are, because everything is so pre-portioned and pre-planned, and the instructions are super clear, so like you're not going to mess it up if you're like us. And if you're good in the kitchen, then it's just less of a hassle, and you get everything that you need. You don't have to run out to the grocery store. So super nice. Try it out. I've really enjoyed the meals that they've sent us so far. I can say that Kevin has too. I highlight that because Kevin is pretty picky when it comes to food. He does not like everything. He has pretty strong specifications and preferences. Very much cares about things like fresh produce and farm produce and things like that. So he's very picky, and I think the fact that he is really enjoying HelloFresh is a testament to the quality here, because he's a stickler for that kind of thing. And so if you are, I think you will enjoy it as well. And again, the URL and promo code that'll get you a sweet discount is hellofresh.com/msheet16. That's MSHEET 16. And use code msheet16. You're going to get 16 free meals plus free shipping. We hope you enjoy it. And again, thank you so much.